introduce Randy Adams. Randy already gave you a little introduction to himself. Dear brother who had a former church in Oklahoma and reached City Hall there and has ideas on how to do that. And I think this is really critical stuff for city reach or civic reach, as well as for us to hear in state capitol ministry plants as well. So Randy, I'm going to hand the baton to you. And then after Randy comes, ask him any questions you might, and then we'll take a little break.
Here. So I really appreciate Ralph giving me the opportunity to speak to you. So many of you are much further along in your capital ministry than I am. But I've been thinking about, in ways that I didn't know how they might apply, politics and the influence of pastors and preachers on politicians for a long time. As a matter of fact, Ralph is going to speak at our convention of the Northwest Baptist Convention. Our annual meeting is next week, and Ralph is going to be speaking to several hundred pastors and leaders in the Northwest next week in our convention, as well as leading a breakout, helping pastors and others know how they can have impact on local government, city and county government. So I'm really thankful for that as well. And Ralph, I don't even know if you know this, but my PhD dissertation actually focused on the impact of preachers and pastors on the thinking of colonial America, especially colonial leaders prior to and concurrent with the American Revolution. So I'll bring a couple of examples out of that as well. But basically, Ralph and I were speaking a month or two ago about the impact on the kingdom concerning reaching leaders. In other words, when leaders are reached, impacted for the gospel, when they are inclined toward the church and toward the work of the church, it often accelerates the conversion of a people. One of the best examples I know of that comes from the English-speaking world and how the gospel and how the church was first planted in England. If you're like me, many of you in this room have some English blood in your background, and one thing I can say about your ancestors and mine is that before they knew Jesus Christ, they were a barbaric, frightening people. And that is true, by the way, of nearly every people group in the world. Before they knew Jesus, morality, ethically, in many ways, a barbaric people. And that was certainly true of the English-speaking peoples. And the way they were reached and the way the church was permanently planted in England was in the year 596, the church commissioned a missionary by the name of Augustine, or Augustine, not the theologian, but another, 150 years after Augustine, commissioned him and 40 others to go and preach the gospel in England. And the closer he got, the more frightened he became. As a matter of fact, he wrote a letter back asking that he be exempt from that charge because he figured they'd kill him when he got there anyway. What happened was, however, when he arrived, he learned that the king, Ethelbert, had married a Christian woman from what is now modern Germany and was predisposed toward the gospel. And get this, on Christmas Day of the year 597, the king and 10,000 were baptized on Christmas Day of 597 in Canterbury, England. And of course, you know the significance of that. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the leader of the Anglican Church. Canterbury Cathedral. Canterbury Cathedral and St. Augustine's Abbey sit on the plot of ground that King Ethelbert gave for just that purpose in the year 597. You can see something similar repeated in many places in the world. Sometimes I think we have thought as pastors and preachers that the gospel is going to first be received or mostly be received by the peasant folk or the common folk. And sometimes we mistakenly believe that's what the New Testament teaches. Not many wise, not many noble, not many mighty. 1 Corinthians 1:26. However, 1 Corinthians 1:26 does not say none of the nobility, none of the wise, none of the mighty. I think 1 Corinthians 1:26 and following does teach us that God does not find us worthy of the gospel because of position or lack thereof. In fact, often the foolish and the weak shame the wise of this world. But what you will find, and what Ralph has shared in part, is that when you survey the New Testament, leaders of various types and kinds were reached from the very beginning. And I'll give you another partial list of those. Ralph has named some. Nicodemus, of course, was one, who defended Jesus to his peers, the the Pharisees, and then, of course, participated in the burial of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea, also a very wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, in whose tomb Jesus' body was placed. The saints in Caesar's household. One of the great phrases in Philippians is when Paul brings greetings to the church in Philippi from the Roman cell where he was held, he brings greetings from the saints in Caesar's household. And who was Caesar but Nero himself? When Paul entered Rome, Nero had placed in Rome a statue of himself in bronze, almost 100 feet tall, almost as big as the Statue of Liberty. I mean, can you imagine? And yet, as someone said, today we name our dog Nero and our son Paul. But some in close proximity to Nero became believers. It does not mean, by the way, they were necessarily people of high position. They could have been slaves and servants, but certainly the gospel penetrated very close to Nero himself, as the text suggests. Of course, Sergius Paulus, whom Ralph mentioned, the proconsul in Cyprus. In Berea, we are told that a number of prominent men and women received Christ. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue in Corinth. We sometimes forget that some Jewish people did come to faith in Christ outside of Jerusalem and outside of Israel, and Crispus was one of those. Church tradition says he became the bishop of Aegina. The Ethiopian eunuch, Ralph mentioned the Ethiopian eunuch, and I think that's a very interesting case because he was the treasurer of Candace, the queen of Ethiopia. The Ethiopians, by the way, have as a tradition that Solomon fathered children with the Queen of Sheba, and that she had some influence or some connection with Ethiopia, and that the dynastic line in Ethiopia traced their lineage back to the Queen of Sheba and to Solomon. Haile Selassie, the great Ethiopian leader, Haile Selassie, was said to have traced his lineage back there. But something else that we know about Ethiopia, by the way, in the 2nd century, we know historically that the church was planted quite strongly in Ethiopia. And Philip Jenkins, in his book, The Lost History of Christianity, records a European traveler in the 16th century going to Ethiopia and observing that there were far more churches in Ethiopia than there were in Europe. He said it was impossible to sing in one church without hearing singing coming from another church. They were so thick in Ethiopia in the 16th century. We sometimes think of the church only in Europe, but the church moved far to the east. The church has been decimated in the east and continues to be so in Syria and Iraq today and other places as well. But the gospel did penetrate into places we don't often think of, and often it was because of leaders like the Ethiopian eunuch who came to faith in Christ. Manaen, the leader of a church in Antioch, was brought up in the household of Herod, the tetrarch. Literally, the text says he was one who eats with. He was at the table of the king. Cornelius, of course, the Roman centurion. Erastus, the city treasurer of Corinth. And there are others also in the New Testament, and Ralph mentioned some of those. There is plenty of evidence in the New Testament and in church history that the conversion of those with influence has led to an expansion of the kingdom in that local area. One of the great examples, and I won't talk much about this because you know of Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor to become a Christian. His mother was a Christian. He became a Christian. You might not know that he declared the Edict of Milan, which granted tolerance to the church all throughout the Roman Empire. That tolerance was largely used by the church to expand and to grow and to build buildings to identify the holy sites. Constantine's mother did in Israel. Constantine also, by the way, was the one who called for the first ecumenical council of the church, the Council of Nicaea. For those of you who know church history, you know those 4 first ecumenical councils, the first one being Nicaea, were critical to defining biblically who Jesus is. Constantine had a huge role in that. Luther and the Reformation. Let me skip to Luther and the Reformation because that's an interesting historical story for us. Luther himself said that much of the reforms he proposed had been proposed prior by John Huss. But John Huss was burned at the stake, burned alive. And the Pope had the same intended for Luther. The reason Luther did not have the fate of Huss was because he had the protection of the German princes and the kings. For different reasons. The Catholic Church actually controlled half the wealth in Germany. And so what you find is that one reason the German princes protected Luther is because that in that way they were able to keep the wealth in Germany and keep it from going to the Roman Catholic Church if in fact they established their own church, which they did. Something else, a lot of historians have said for a long time that the growth of Lutheranism or Protestantism was largely among the peasants and the lower rural classes, and that's not true. Luther's movement was largely an urban movement, and it was largely the bourgeoisie. It was the manufacturing class, it was the tradesmen, physicians, lawyers, civil bureaucrats, people like that who carried the ball for Luther in the Reformation. Very interesting to note, by the way, that Luther, although he had the support of many of the princes, an interesting side note, as the Reformation spread, basically whether a nation or a people went Protestant or Catholic was determined by the autocratic leader, the king or the prince. Of interest is, if the Catholic Church was already weak in the province, they stayed with the Catholic Church. If the Catholic Church was very strong and controlled the wealth of the province, they went with the Protestant Church, because in that way the king could keep the wealth to himself and in his province and keep it from going to the Catholic Church. So the motives were not always so good, and yet the result was such that Luther was protected and the Reformation spread, and God did it in his own way. Something else, the university system. I found this fascinating as I studied and researched for this a little bit, that the records still exist for every single university student in Germany in the 16th century. I mean, you can discover, and the names are known, of every student. Every student that was in one of Luther's classes, and Melanchthon, his right-hand man. And very significant research has been done with the 461 towns in Germany, in that area of the world. What students went to the university and which did they attend? This university at Wittenberg, where Luther taught, quickly grew following the 95 Thesis and all that he did in 1517. By 1520, Wittenberg was the largest university in Germany. Another university that really took to Luther's reforms was Basel in Switzerland. And research has been done, again, to show that if in those 461 towns, if the majority of students went to Wittenberg or Basel or another university that was favorable toward Luther, that town became Protestant. If, however, the majority of students from one of those 461 towns went to Cologne or one of the other Catholic towns and Catholic universities, the town stayed Catholic. I thought that was quite interesting. So what you see in the Reformation is, and by the way, the Reformation spread largely through professors or those who became professors. Many of these students who were under the tutelage of Luther and Melanchthon and other reformers, many of them became the professors, the pastors, the teachers, the leaders that furthered the Reformation. So you see Luther reaching future leaders, but you also see the current set of leadership, the bourgeoisie. They were the ones who financed and largely extended the Reformation throughout much of Europe. Let me skip to America for a little bit, the colonial world in America, colonial life in America prior to the Revolutionary War. I mentioned I did my dissertation on that era, and I've never really found practical application for this, Ralph.
Until now.
Until now. So I'm wondering, maybe what I did 20 plus years ago has application now. But I started with a man by the name of Jonathan Mayhew. Jonathan Mayhew is a pastor in Boston. In 1749, he preached a highly influential message, and it was put in print. American pastors, by the way, in the colonial era, about 40% of their sermons, or 40% had their sermons published. Published in papers, published in pamphlets. They published far more than we do today and had great influence thereby. The education of the populace largely came through the pulpit and through the church. Well, Jonathan Mayhew, on the 100th anniversary of the death or the martyrdom, depending on how you define it, of Charles I, the King of England. There was a rebellion against Charles I 100 years prior. He was killed in the rebellion. And Jonathan Mayhew's message was on that anniversary. And the great question was this: do the people have a right to resist a tyrant? Or is the divine right of kings an absolute? And what Mayhew said, arguing from Scripture, from Romans 13, 1 through 7, he said the people have a right to resist a tyrant. Now, he did not say they should have killed him and that they did right by killing Charles I, but he did list the grievances against Charles I. He listed the rights of man and argued for the rights of man, and how if the grievances are continuing and if they are of such a weight that the rights of the people are being buried under those grievances, then the people have a right to rebel. Now, what's so very interesting about Mayhew's message is that John Adams said it was published a year before he attended Harvard, and he said he obtained the manuscript and he studied it and memorized it until it was part of himself. And it's not known if Thomas Jefferson knew of that message prior to the Declaration of Independence, but I will tell you this: when you read that message, of course it's a sermon, it's far longer than the Declaration of Independence, but the argument that Mayhew makes is a parallel to the argument that Jefferson made in the Declaration, setting forth the rights of man, setting forth the grievances against the king. It's exactly what Mayhew did. In 1818, John Adams wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson commending that sermon, saying every American schoolboy ought to be brought up on that sermon because it set forth the political obligations of leaders and it set forth the rights of man. So we know that Jefferson knew of it after he penned the Declaration. And Adams, by the way, as you might remember, he was the chair of the committee that was assigned to write the Declaration of Independence. Adams was the man with experience, but he understood the brilliance and the rhetorical gift of Jefferson, and so he assigned Jefferson to actually put pen to paper. So Mayhew's message was highly influential. Something else about colonial America: in Massachusetts and Connecticut especially, there were election sermons. So that when those who were elected last night, when they were seated in assembly, a pastor, a preacher, would be called forth to declare what the role of government was and what the role of church was, and to set things straight in that regard. Very, very interesting. When we look at the founding of our nation, when we look at our the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, some of our founding documents, some of the early decisions that were made, understand that those men who were in assembly, the 30, or actually going back to the 17th century, they were being tutored by pastors, at least annually, and through the messages that were disseminated. For a long, long time, they were being tutored on the role of government and the role of the church as well. A side note for my Baptist brothers in the room is that only one Baptist was invited to preach an election sermon during those years. And I looked at the year 1750 to 1783, the ending of the war. The one Baptist was Samuel Stillman, pastor of the First Baptist Church of Boston. And his election sermon was in 1779, right in the midst of the war. And the Baptist said two things that nobody else said. He said, while we're fighting for liberty, we need to fight for religious liberty. And you might remember, religious liberty did not exist in the colonies. States, colonies, they had the right to choose what church they would support. As a matter of fact, Massachusetts supported a state church until 1836. Religious liberty was not extended to the states. It was a federal issue, but it was not extended to the states until much later. But he said two things. We ought to fight for religious liberty and we ought to free the slaves. He said everybody ought to be free after following this war. And so I'm proud of Samuel Stillman in that regard. When you look at, just to give another example, because he's a political hero, Abraham Lincoln. I think Lincoln was highly influenced by Phineas Gurley, who was a pastor of the New York Presbyterian Church, New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Lincoln actually chose that church rather than the one the presidents more typically attended, because the other church had Southerners and whatnot in it. And he said Phineas Gurley did not preach politics from the pulpit. Phineas Gurley preached the word and preached the gospel. And what Lincoln said was, when I go to church, I want to hear the gospel proclaimed, even though, as you know, he was never baptized, he never formally joined that church, but he was a regular attender with his family. He said, I want to hear the gospel proclaimed from the pulpit, not politics from the pulpit. Phineas Gurley did have considerable influence with him. He did his son's funeral, for example, as he did Lincoln's funeral as well. But I've often thought, when you read the addresses of the presidents, that the best theologian we've ever had in the White House is the one who never got baptized. You know, Lincoln, his second inaugural address, I thought, so well said, better than any preacher I've read of that era, gave a theological argument for why the war extended so long. Another example from Europe, and I won't talk about this long, is William Wilberforce. And many of you know William Wilberforce's story. He was the one who for so long advocated the abolition of slavery from Great Britain. Took him his entire political life, over 30 years, for that to happen. Actually 20 years before the trade was outlawed. But what you might not remember is that John Newton highly influenced him. John Newton of Amazing Grace. John Newton was a pastor. John Newton felt his calling was to preach and evangelize and pastor the church, but he understood that there was a call to government service that was complementary to his call to the pulpit. And he actually encouraged Wilberforce not to go into the ministry, but instead to run for office. And so Wilberforce entered the Parliament and had tremendous influence. Also, while Wilberforce was in the Parliament, the Clapham Group, which was a group of evangelical laymen and preachers, supported him immensely. You know, these guys who are standing up, and these gals who are standing up for the right, they need people to stand with them and stand behind them and support them and pray for them. Charles Simeon was one of those, who was a very prominent pastor of the time. And several others also supported Wilberforce in all of his efforts. Let me give you one kind of interesting example from American history. In thinking about this, after Ralph asked me to do this, one of my roles when I was in Oklahoma was to oversee a lot of our Native American work. And Oklahoma has about 190, Oklahoma Baptists have 190 Native American churches, about 50 Cherokee churches, a lot of Choctaw churches, and the various people, you know, the 5 civilized tribes, quote unquote, and then many other tribes are present in Oklahoma. And I wondered, because the Cherokees are quite Christian and quite Baptist, as it turns out, and I wondered if there was the conversion of a chief early on that helped open the hearts of the Cherokee people to the gospel. I couldn't find evidence of that. Sequoyah is one of the Cherokee heroes. He's the person who put language in printed form, developed their alphabet and their written language. However, now I live in the Northwest. I'm actually from Montana, and a part of Montana history is the Nez Perce Indians and Chief Joseph. And so I was just trying to do some research and trying to do some, and you know, Chief Joseph, and many of you know that name, he was a person highly respected not only for his military acumen, but also in his strategic thinking, but also as a very, very good man. And I wondered, I just thought, was Chief Joseph a Christian? And so what I discovered was his dad, Old Chief Joseph, as he was called, was one of the first baptized believers among the Nez Perce Indians. There was a Presbyterian missionary, Henry Spalding, who went to the capital of the Nez Perce Nation, little town in Idaho, still there, it's still their capital, and went there in 1836, before the Oregon Trail, which brought a lot of settlers west. That happened and begun in 1840, which, by the way, Whitman, the missionary Whitman, he and his wife, who were massacred several years later, led the first wagon train along the Oregon Trail. He came as a missionary 4 years prior, about the time Spalding did. But Spalding went to the Nez Perce Indians, and in 1838, one of his very first converts and one of the first people he baptized was Old Chief Joseph. And young Chief Joseph, the one that we know as Chief, and his name is Joseph, by the way, because of the Joseph of Scripture. That became his Christian name. His son, much of his early years were spent in the mission, in the Christian mission, being tutored and taught by the missionaries. Now, the downside of all of this is that in 1855, the treaty that the American government made with the Nez Perce, which was quite generous, was reneged upon, like so many of those were. In 1863, theirs was, and that resulted in the war with the Nez Perce. The other thing I read, and this was so grievous, is that old Chief Joseph took his Bible and shredded it. Shredded his Bible when the U.S. government reneged on the treaty with the Nez Perce. I didn't know this, but I looked, the seal of the Nez Perce tribe still has on the seal Treaty of 1855. They remember that. We forget that. They all know that treaty, which was not upheld by our government. And one of my thoughts was, how much different would it be for the Nez Perce and some of the other Native American tribes, many of whom, by the way, were quite evangelized in the 19th century, much more so for some than they are today. How much different could it have been? But I would have you take note, there are hundreds of Presbyterian Christians among the Nez Perce. And there is a quite strong Presbyterian Nez Perce church there in their capital. And it seems to me, and this is a correlation, I can't show it as a causation, but it seems to me that the conversion of their chief, old Chief Joseph, opened the door to the gospel for the Nez Perce, and we still see evidence of that today. It could be much greater, I think, had things turned out differently, but it's still there today. Now, as Ralph said, the church I pastored for 19 years, 11 of those years in McAlester, Oklahoma. Great church, loved that church. We saw God do a lot of things in that church. Had I known today what I'm learning through Capital Ministries, I would have done a lot better job. But we did see God do some neat things among political leaders, and I feel like we kind of fell into that. And I want to tell you how we sort of fell into some of that. I love the instruction that God gave through Jeremiah in Jeremiah 29 to the exiles in Babylon. The Jewish leaders who were exiled in Babylon. You remember what God told them through Jeremiah? He said, bless the city, pray for and work for the peace and the prosperity of Babylon. Continue to build houses and marry off your children and work toward the prosperity of the city. So that the Jewish exiles in Babylon were seen as those who were trying to work toward the betterment of the community. And I think part of what happened in McAlester was we were seen as a great partner in wanting to build a better city. As a result, we gained influence with the mayor and the city manager and the principals and the Department of Health and Human Services and our state senator, who at that time was said to be the most powerful person in Oklahoma, by the way, whom I had almost nothing in common politically, but we reached him. He came and joined our church and was faithful in attendance in our church, and exactly what rubbed off, I don't know. He's now, I pray, with the Lord. But we saw some really cool things happen there. I baptized 2 of the sheriffs. We started a law enforcement dinner where every year we would honor our law enforcement, invite everybody in. That led to personal relationships that led to the salvation of our sheriff. And when he left office and retired, the new sheriff came in and was able to lead him to the Lord, and he was baptized in our church. We began looking at what were some of the needs in the community that maybe our church could meet and give us inroads evangelistically. And I'll just share a couple of examples. The Department of Health and Human Services, we had a child, oh, by the way, I also did a monthly lunch, a monthly business person's lunch, and we were a downtown church, so we would get a lot of the city folks over, sometimes the county judge, who's now the Supreme Court Chief Justice in Oklahoma. We would get the DA, who was a Christian lady, and she would come, and some others, in that monthly lunch, which was really my opportunity to speak to the community at large, not just our church members, but the community at large. And we had really good attendance. And part of that was our proximity to City Hall. The county courthouse was right beside us as well, and then a lot of downtown businesses. But one of the things that happened while I was there was Department of Health and Human Services. We had a child removed from the home of one of our church members. And what I learned was that child had 1 hour a month with the parents. And they told me that things were going well, and they thought the child would be reintegrated into the home. But I thought, 1 hour a month, this is nuts. I mean, how can you do that? And I'd already, the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, I'd gotten to know him, and I asked him that question. I said, how can you make any progress 1 hour a month between parent and child? He said, I totally agree with you. He said, the problem is we are understaffed and we don't have space. He said, all of our meeting rooms are continually used, and all of our staff is continually, because you have to have a monitor to be there when they meet. And he said, we just have no more staff, we have no more space. Well, what we have in churches during the week in particular is empty classrooms, and we've got people who have a heart for the community, a heart for the gospel, who would be volunteers if that was allowed. We became the first church in Oklahoma, and I don't know that it's spread, to offer our facility, and he agreed. Our facility was used during the week for the child to meet with the parents, and we had 14 of our people trained to be volunteer monitors. Now, what we trained our volunteer monitors to do was to listen. Basically, their job was to just be there to make sure nothing bad happened, but they could listen. And then the Department of Health and Human Services, he was a Christian, I said, can our people pray, if allowed to, with the parents and the child? He said, absolutely. If they want to request, can I pray for you, they can do that. And then we trained our folks to listen for needs and opportunities that our church could address in the lives of those families. And it was a marvelous, marvelous thing. Other things happened with the school system. I mean, we just had a great relationship with the school system and a lot of the local officials. But I say all that to say, a lot of it was relational based. What Ralph said about loving people, you know. One of the things I had to tutor our church on a little bit, not everybody in the church, but some, is when our state senator, who like I said, he was pro-abortion, he was so many things, and I wasn't, and that our church wasn't, but he came. And we had city councilmen come, and the city manager came, and others. And on occasion, they would be accosted at the door by somebody for a position they took. And so what I did with our deacon body and those I needed to was help them know, when these folks come here, let them worship. Let me speak to them from the pulpit, let them hear the word in the Sunday, but don't accost them on a political matter when they're here to worship, or we won't have them come. We had a long-term approach, understanding, by the way, John Newton, Amazing Grace, you might remember he was a slave trader. When God saved him, it was years and years before he turned away from the slave trade. It's interesting. His conversion did not automatically get him out of that life. It took time, and therefore he had a deliberate, prayerful approach and a non-judgmental approach to those who didn't agree with him. And I think that is really important if we're going to have impact on the hearts and minds of people, is not expect them to be where we are day one, or even before day one being conversion day. So anyway, any questions that you might have about any of that or something else that I might be able to address? One thing I would say, just so I don't forget, our nation is quite diverse. I was in Oklahoma with Brother Doug here. We have been friends a long time. We don't just look alike. We've known each other a long time. I tell people in the Northwest the difference between the Northwest and Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, where I pastored, if you joined our church, it helped your business. In the Northwest, that is not true. And increasingly, it's not true anywhere. So what we have to teach is that Jesus is worth it no matter what. I just read when Francis Schaeffer, toward the end of his life, someone asked Francis Schaeffer the question, do you think we will win? And Schaeffer said, in terms of bringing America back, and Schaeffer said, if you're in this to win, you're in it for the wrong reason. It's not about winning. It's about obedience. It's about faithfulness. It's about standing up for the truth. It's about the long game. Just as Ralph so well said, it's not measured in weeks and months. It's measured in decades. And so increasingly, we're not calling people to a gospel that's going to improve their political career necessarily. But if Jesus is worth it. I've been doing mission work in China now for several years, and Bangladesh and other places, and over there, when they accept, my parents were in Afghanistan and Pakistan, when you accept Jesus there, buddy, if it's found out, you're dead in Afghanistan. You're dead. And so people have to understand Jesus is worth it no matter what, no matter what. Question?
I grew up in Weatherford, Oklahoma. And we didn't know McAllister for being the political center. He was obviously known because of the state penitentiary there.
Right.
And that was kind of the label that your city had on it. Can you speak to us about dealing with politicians within that, and civic leaders within that context of also being known as the place for the criminals?
McAllister, the highest ranking politician in the history of the state, is from McAllister. He's dead now, but Carl Albert, he was a Speaker of the U.S. House. And then Gene Stipe was the person I referenced. He was a state senator for 50 years. He was the head of the Transportation Committee in the Senate. He ran the prison system basically also as a part of that and other things. When I went there, it was really interesting to me that though the state penitentiary is in that town, and it's sort of an impressive facility, it's all white just to see it, the search committee didn't take me by the prison. And I remember the committee chairman, who was a great man, but he said, those aren't good jobs at the prison. Well, those jobs feed a lot of families. Those jobs keep us safe, you know. So about a year into my pastorate, it was no surprise to me when I came to know we had nobody in our church who worked at the prison who was active in our church. We began to pray about that. We saw Frank Morgan, a captain of the guard, converted. He was the first conversion. And then we saw God do a work among several who were employed at the prison. The warden, the chaplain of the prison joined our church. The warden was not a member of our church, but he would watch often on TV. We were on local cable and local radio, and so had an influence with him and a relationship with him. But prison towns are interesting. In McAllister, when they did executions, you didn't even know it in town. And that's where they did the executions, and they do them in Oklahoma, by the way. People ignored the prison. They didn't want to think about it. But our church tried. We started a ministry, for example, where before guys got out of prison, because there was a minimum security facility there as well, we had a guy on our staff who would lead a relationship weekend, basically, with him and his spouse, to help them know how to make the first steps to making this thing work when they got out. We sponsored what we call the hospitality house and had it built while I was there. And what that was a place where wives and girlfriends and daughters, young children, could come and stay for free. We asked them for $5 room and board a day, if they could do it. If they couldn't, they didn't pay a dime. But it was an effort basically to make it easier for these women to come, try to keep the family together. They would usually sleep in their cars. They're all poor. And so that facility helped. We were trying to work on the family unit when these guys got out of prison. But I could probably go on, but there was a number of things like that we did. Yeah, and our church was just a part of that. We partnered with the other Baptist churches in the area. We were the biggest partner, but yeah.